is a stand-in for sand, silt, and clay, the mineral substrate of soil, which is basically just broken down rocks. Okay, when we learn about soil science, we often learn that soil is made up of certain amounts of sand, silt, and clay, and then you call it this kind of soil or that kind of soil. But without any life, this sand, silt, and clay doesn't actually have a real structure. These particles don't have a relationship to each other than that they are piled on top of each other in whatever way they got there. If a wind comes along, these blow away. So, but let's see what happens when we rain on soil, on sand, silt, and clay without any biology in it. This is what soil will revert back to when we mistreat it. And this is what soil starts as before it becomes soil. So who would like to make a rain cloud? Really? All these people and nobody wants to make a rain cloud? Okay, no. So just poke some holes in the bottom of that cup. Okay. And I want you to imagine a room of 150 ranchers in Kansas all making rain clouds at once. Well, now we need to find God. Who would like to do that? Donnie, I think you're good. You are to me.
Don't eat them.
High expectations.
Okay. So you get to pour the water into the cloud. And
Which
feel free to
altitude?
stand up. Well, probably we have nice oriental roads here, so we'll stand up so you can see. Move over. Okay, what's happening to our landscape?
Running off.
Okay, the rain is running off. Is any of it getting down into the plant roots? No. Okay, and I know, there's props that are missing here. We're going to do that for our next tour.
Well, if I was really God, I wouldn't let this happen.
Okay, I think we better stop pretty soon because what else is happening here?
Flood.
Okay, we have a flood. And is the water clean? No, it's not. So what's in the water? There's soil, sediment, silt, and what else on a modern landscape is there?
Pesticides.
There's pesticides, Roundup, all kinds of nasty stuff. There's even, there's maybe, pharmaceutical drugs or whatever, right? So, if we were to put this out into a hot summer day, what would happen to that soil surface? It would crust over, and then the next time that you did get rain, it would run off even faster, right? So it starts sealing off. And that's for a variety of reasons, but part of it is that the smallest particles find their way in between the sand particles and fill it in and make this crust. What do you need to add to flour besides liquid to turn it into bread? Yeast, which is life, which is living, which is a microorganism. And it's not exactly the same process in terms of the work that's being done, but it is microbial work that takes sand, silt, and clay and turns it into healthy soil. So, and healthy soil, or the soil carbon sponge, the difference here is that these particles have a relationship to each other. There is pore space here. There are glues, the snots, slimes, and glues of life that have glued these particles into a living, breathing matrix, the tissue of the land, the mucous membrane of the land, and the little threads of life have helped to bind those together, so the root hairs and the fungal hyphae. And then all the living things that can move have made tunnels through there and passageways, so everything from springtail up to Fritz the dog have dug holes in there so that when it's really dry you can kickstart the system. But they've dug them into something that doesn't move. So if an earthworm tried to dig through there, their burrow would collapse, right? But if you're moving through here, you have a structure within which to build more structure. It's the basic infrastructure of life. So let's see what happens when we rain on this landscape. What happened to Right
behind you there.
Oh, good, okay. So we also, because we're having a drought, we need to ask for more water. Oh, interesting, that's lemonade. Somebody's gotta have some water around here, I know we're in California, but really.
There's somebody about
Oh, perfect, okay.
spring water.
Perfect.
Spring water.
Okay,
Right.
all right.
Do you
So-
need God?
Yeah, I need another dog. Sally?
I guess I
Oh, okay, yeah, he's back, okay.
Right back again.
We found God.
We have faith, okay.
My job wasn't done.
All right,
God's work is never done. That's right.
so we're gonna rain on here. Now, remember, we only got a half a cup into the other one. And what's happening that's different?
So,
Absorbing it.
It's soaking in. Why is it soaking in here instead of running
No,
off?
it's a space.
Because there's space, yeah.
There's
Yeah, there's space, there's
place to fill that
channels.
space.
And in a living landscape, this could go down meters, right? And what's happening to that water as it's soaking in? It's
being
getting
absorbed
filtered, it's
in.
going through a carbon filter. Okay, so part of it is a structural filter, and part of it is a biological filter. So the biology that is living in here, that has made this thing, is also breaking down anything that shouldn't
Well,
be
you
in the
also,
water
you also have
system.
chemical attraction of various things getting bound. Is the-
Yes, yes, so we have a really complex system working to create clean water. Okay, and what I've found in doing this is we can do at least 9 cups here.
Wow.
Versus like a half a cup of, and we still won't have a flood. What we will have is we will have a spring coming out from under and coming back up somewhere else.
Wow.
Okay.
The water's out.
Yeah, 9 Dixie cups.
Just say 9,
Yeah,
isn't that correct?
yeah. Check it out. It's powerful, it's fun. And part of that is because it can expand, right? Yeah. Okay, so there are lots of, so this is just the beginning of what we can do with this, but let's just ask a few questions. If you lived somewhere like Vermont, where we get a lot of rain and we've had a lot of trouble with flooding, which landscape would you rather live in? The bread.
The bread.
Okay. And how about in a place where you only got a few inches of rain a year?
The bread.
Still the bread, yeah.
Because you wouldn't want to lose what little you got.
Exactly, yes. And how about if you lived somewhere very, very hot?
Still the bread.
Okay, yeah. And how about if you lived somewhere very windy?
The bread.
Okay, starting to get it? Okay, yeah. So, anyway, there's a lot more we can do with this, but we have Walter here just for one night, and so I'm gonna let him explain a lot more about what we just showed.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much, Didi, and hello everybody. I'm Walter, and I'm a soil microbiologist from down under, right? So I'm innocent bystander, quietly underground. But basically, yeah, look, I've spent 50 years as a scientist and strategic policy work, but now retired, and we've got a group called Healthy Soils Australia, very, very innovative farmers in Australia doing, really regenerative agriculture, resilience building, but also the big issue is climate change, adapting. How do we adapt to what we're facing in Australia? Australia's the driest inhabited continent. You in southwest US, California as well, obviously facing exactly the same issues. What are we doing long term to address climate change and really build the resilience? But perhaps more importantly, the bigger thing, how do we cool the climate? Right? How do we actually naturally and safely cool the climate? And so that's what we've been working on, and then progressively, from being quietly, innocently underground, you get drawn into a global debate on these things. And so, look, I'm very happy to be here. This is the first time I've been in California, but look, very important to have this discussion, this open, critical discussion of, okay, what are we doing? How do we, basically regenerate our landscape? How do we cool the climate? and how do we actually secure a future for the 10 billion people projected by mid-century, because if not, it's pretty sad. Okay, and basically the question came up, Rehydrate California, can we? And it's with humble question marks at the end of it, right? Nobody's saying we're here telling you how to rehydrate California, but we're certainly asking the question, can we? And if so, what do we have to do that? And the powerful thing about that is just what Didi sort of said. It's very simple, the take-home message, the real key marketing. Yes, we need to and can regenerate the Earth's soil carbon sponge. That's simple. And in fact, that soil carbon sponge is what nature used to create this biosphere. It's what nature used to create the hydrology. It's what nature used to create the whole hydrological dynamics of this planet. That hydrological dynamics governs 95% of the heat processes in this planet. It governs all the cooling processes, and quite frankly now it's the only thing that can actually sort of save humanity from what we've locked in through global warming and climate change. So that's a bigger issue. But particularly for California and agriculture, water, food, social security, social stability, it's really how do we rebuild that soil carbon sponge that becomes the issue. What is it that we can do? I mean, first of all, why do we have to build it? And I think that's already pretty obvious. California here, you're basically facing these extremes, as we are in Australia: floods, droughts, wildfires, soil degradation, landslips, and all those things are actually accelerating, and they will continue to accelerate. And so, just as Didi has shown, we've got to find some way to build resilience and buffering into our land systems, because that's going to be fundamental for addressing these increasing extremes. So that's the first reason why we must build that carbon sponge, the Earth soil carbon sponge. But then the issue becomes, how can we do that? What is it that we can learn from nature on how to do it? And it's actually quite elegant and very simple, because if you go back, and somebody mentioned this young person, well, we'll go back when I was younger, 420 million years ago, and we had basically oceans and rock on this planet, right? There was no life on land. It was just basically oceans with teeming life, because we'd had the Cambrian explosion, multicellular life was living there, but nothing on land. It was just arid, dry rock. Okay, but life on the oceans depended on nutrients being leached from that rock by rain into the oceans. So it was a nutrient-limited life. And so in a competitive world, which obviously life is all about, basically there was a real strategic competitive advantage for fungi or for life to get onto that land. And of course it did it through fungi, because they're tubes, microscopic tubes that could grow onto the rock. They've got all the enzymes for solubilizing rocks, and so that's exactly what they did. But the fungi had a problem, because they actually are heterotrophs, like us. They're proto-animals actually, and they can't fix their own sugars, right? They can't make their own energy. So what the fungi did, obviously they had to form a symbiosis, a marriage, a relationship with blue-green algae that were already in the oceans. And basically the blue-green algae and the fungi in combination could go AWOL. They could be independent on the land, because they had sugar and nutrients, and off they were on a picnic. And these things are still around us all today. They're called the lichens. And wherever you go in nature, and all the rocks, our concrete, our cities, everything, wood, it's all rotting down. It's all biodegrading. Lichens, symbiotic associations between fungi and algae, breaking down rocks and basically creating life. And it's from those initial lichens that very rapidly nature then evolved basically mosses, ferns, liverworts, cycads, gymnosperms, angiosperms, and 50 million years ago, grasses. And how did nature evolve that? It evolved that because it created soils. Because as those fungal hyphae and lichens grew through the soil, they left behind organic detritus. Okay, so for the first time we had pedogenesis, the actual creation of soils. And soils are just a mixture of mineral detritus and organic detritus mixed up together, and for the first time soils. So really it was pedogenesis and the formation of soils that was the formation starting point for life on land. But of course soils are just more than a crude mixture, because basically those soils have enormously powerful effects, which we'll go through. And those pedogenesis processes and those soil forming processes are now the tools, the only tools we've got for the future. But if we use them wisely, we have a very, very healthy and prosperous and wonderful future. If not, it's cactus. Okay, so basically that's the thing. Obviously life very quickly, having evolved these things, was able to colonize 13 billion hectares of the 13.9 billion hectares of land on this planet. So we have biosystems spreading all over the land surface through this, high-form microbial process, soil building process. And of course we can look at how does that work. I mean, you can go over here and basically say, look, what happens? What happens when you do that? And in a sense, you can start off with a rock, and a rock is just stardust. It's just basically co-aggregated mineral particles. And obviously these were formed 4.6 million years ago, but we coalesced to make rock, the 9 planets, and that's what rock is, right? It's got a density of about 2.6 to 3.5 grams per cc. That's its bulk density. That's the weight of the volume of rock. And of course, if we put a drop of water on that rock, I mean, it's even worse than what Didi showed. Obviously, it just runs off. There's no water, there's no life, it's dead. And what pedogenesis did, what soil formation did, was very, very simple. You basically had the sun, CO2 and water, and then basically plants evolved, and we talked about the blue-green algae 3.5 billion years ago. And those plants turned these ingredients into sugars, C6H12O6, right, sugar compounds. And what these sugar compounds did, obviously they fed the fungi, they were the substance of this biological life. So life then created soils, but by solubilizing soils, it was able to take these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10, so we've got 10 soil particles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And basically, instead of having them all concentrated together, these sugars, through the action of fungi, form stable soil carbon. I'll just get this one, that might be a bit brighter. Yeah, beautiful. And we can draw them as little springs, right? So you had all this carbon that formed between the soil's particles and actually created a soil which has a bulk density of 1.2 grams per cc. Okay, so we basically, or we didn't, but nature, by adding carbon into this soil, in the form of these organic detrituses, fungal detrituses, created an open, spongy soil, which is effectively what Didi showed us with the bread. Okay, so basically it's exactly like the bread. Here's a microorganism that solubilized this, left detritus behind, and created this sponge. And now we have a healthy soil, but it's got 1.2 grams, this is 2.6 to 3.6, so you know that what is 66% of that healthy soil? It's nothing, it's air. So basically nature, all she did was basically say, look, I've got sunshine, CO2, water, I can produce these sugars, and that simple process of producing sugars with fungi producing this stable soil carbon, and we end up with a matrix, an open porous matrix, mineral particles, 2 to 3% carbon, all that's needed, and all of a sudden we've created a sponge. And the properties of the sponge are very, very critical, because now we've got 66%, or up to 66% of that sponge is nothing. Okay, so when people ask you what makes a healthy soil, you simply say nothing. Right? Add nothing. But nature's smart like that, you see, because she hasn't got all this equipment, she doesn't need it. But once you've got nothing, you've got voids. And so now all of a sudden we have voids, and it's those voids, that's where Didi, when God put the water in the voids, in the spread, see that water went into the voids. So straight away we have water holding capacity. 1 gram of carbon added to soil can hold 8 grams of water in its own matrix, and even more in the voids that it creates. Okay, so we have a soil that now can hold water beautifully in its soil. Once we have, in a sense, an open matrix, we also vastly increase the nutrient availability in that soil. We increase its biofertility. Because obviously this is stardust. These are the 96 natural elements that, of course, we know all about in the periodic table. And of course these nutrients, whether it's calcium, magnesium, selenium, zinc, phosphorus, you name it, they're all sitting on charged surfaces, but basically when they're in a rock form, they're unavailable. Okay, they're in a rock. Even if we want to mine them, we have to crush the rock and extract them. But now we've got all those nutrients available on charges on these surfaces, right? And so we basically massively increase the nutrient availability of that soil. Over 80% of the productivity of all soils isn't about how much fertilizer we put on. It's not about its nutrient content, how many nutrients in that rock. It's all about the availability of those nutrients. And by having created the sponge, we've massively increased that nutrient availability. And so we've increased the biofertility of it. So nature creates rainforests on sand dunes in Australia, but it creates absolutely powerful gardens of Eden. If you go back to California 400 years ago, gardens of Eden, out of basically natural soils, because it's increasing the availability of these nutrients rather than adding them. Okay, so this is really the fundamental lesson. I grew up in the Green Revolution, 1960s, agriculture, it's when I was finishing my studies and stuff, and was employed with CSIRO, our premier research institute, looking at the whole Green Revolution, tropical agricultural productivity. And it was all about basically how do we get nutrients happening. But it's not about adding nutrients. It's about using these natural fungal, microbial, soil health processes to increase their availability. And these rainforests existing on sands, the most bioproductive terrestrial ecosystem on basically next to nothing, because every molecule of phosphorus is moving 1,000 times faster in cycling in that system than in other soils. So we've got 1,000 times productivity dividend without adding anything. If we can do that in agriculture, we can do that in agriculture. When we do that in agriculture, we can feed the 10 billion. Okay, that's not all though. Basically, once we have a healthy soil with all these voids and stuff like that, guess what? We have rootability. It's not rude, it's quite okay. We can actually sort of grow, we can grow roots right down through this soil very, very effectively because there's all the voids and what have you. And so now we find roots can go down, 10 meters. We've got our desert plants roots to 50 meters, right down into porous soil, getting water from subsoil levels. But the powerful thing now is instead of using 20 centimeters of soil, relying all our food production and resilience having to be on that top 20 centimeters of soil, if we're in a compacted or degraded or industrial, compromised soil, we can now have 2 meters of soil. So the volume of minerals and water and surfaces we've got access to is exploded exponentially. So our productivity is exploded. Once we've got a soil like this, we've also got all these surfaces, so we've got enormous opportunity for microbial life activities, living organisms, not just fungi, bacteria, actinomycetes, protozoa, nematodes, everything to be vibrant. It's a zoo. There's over 10 times the biomass weight of living microorganisms in a healthy soil than the animals above it. 10 times that biomass. And it's all cycling nutrients, driving productivity. And again, we now create healthy soils, healthy biosystems. So straight away we're in the business of, okay, here's our whole microbial ecology. We forgot to write down roots. Okay? And so when we can have water, nutrients, active microbial health, disease resistance, root ability to give us soil volume, we've got productivity. Okay, so basically nature created these highly productive systems like our rainforest on sand dunes by basically not adding things, but just by basically creating sponges, voids, nothing. Out of that productivity, or as part of that productivity, it also created the resilience of that soil. Okay, so all of this comes down, and here's the resilience of that soil. Because now that soil has got the capacity to maintain longevity of green growth. Okay, it can keep on growing because there's enough water in that sponge, in that bread, to maintain the longevity of green growth. I'm a scientist, you know, we've done a lot of genetic breedings. With genetics, even genetic engineering, we're lucky to get 30% yield increases. 30%, we're really, hey, we want Nobel Prizes for that stuff, right? But basically, with building the soil carbon sponge, we can increase the longevity of green growth tenfold. Okay, you've got a 2-inch rainfall, instead of having growth for 10 days, we can have growth for 100 days. Because that soil is retaining, that bread that Didi showed us is retaining the moisture. And so the whole productivity, resilience dividends are enormous. And of course, now we come back to California, we come back to climate change, because as you are feeling and going to intensify climate extremes, wildfires, droughts, floods, landslips, soil degradation, all sorts of pressures on your land resources, and that's all we've got to live on. It's a resilience of that landscape that's really critical. So we have to build resilience. Resilience is absolutely connected to the soil carbon sponge, right? Rebuilding the soil carbon sponge. And so that becomes actually the most powerful, most practical, direct action that we can do. And really, it's all we need to do. I mean, we often have a lot to do. But really, it's rebuilding that earth soil carbon sponge, which is really powerful in securing our future. Now, all we're doing in this game is we're actually sort of taking carbon from the air and using plants, as nature did, to take carbon, CO2 from the air with sunshine, making sugars, making stable soil carbon. You'll notice as well that all we're doing is we're having to add 2 to 3, 4% of carbon to that soil to build the bed springs, you know, to build the sponge, to build this thing. So it's really amazing how little carbon, relatively, we may have to add to rebuild soil health. So the whole issue now comes to climate change and CO2, and really the carbon drawdown discussion, right? Because sure, we have put CO2 in the atmosphere. You know, it's gone up from 280 to 406 parts per billion, parts per million, and basically, you know, that's the problem. We've got a symptom telling us that, hey, something is wrong with the biosphere. Of course, we've got to take that symptom away, and we've got to put that carbon back into these soil carbon sponges. But the critical thing isn't just to draw down carbon from the air. The critical thing is to rebuild healthy soils with it. Because just drawing down carbon is like mopping up the blood on the floor. We've got to stop the bleeding, and we've got to get the patient healthy again. Okay? So getting the patient healthy again is rebuilding that sponge. We rebuild the sponge, just as Didi showed us, by basically saying, here is carbon from the air that can be fixed into these stable carbon forms to rebuild that structure. So really the whole climate debate that we're facing globally, but particularly in Mediterranean climates, be it in Australia or California, is yes, how do we build these sponges, how do we rebuild this hydrology? And we can do that safely, naturally, productively by rebuilding this soil carbon sponge. Certainly we've got to use these plants to draw down carbon. We can do that. We've got biosystems. Every year the Earth draws down 120 billion tonnes of carbon. And this is really what we had with Charles Keeling back in 1958. Remember, basically there's the Keeling curve, and there's CO2 going up from 280 to 406 parts per million again, sorry. Now, right, that's CO2. And what Charles showed us from 1958, well that's 58, that's 70 years ago, is basically, yes, every year there's emissions of carbon, but there's also the drawdown of carbon, right? And what he showed us very clearly that, yes, of course we've got to slow down emissions, no question about that. Nobody's saying we don't do that. But really what the significant thing is that the actual drawdown of carbon has been compromised. Okay, the planet isn't drawing down as much carbon as it used to. It's only drawing down 120 billion tonnes of carbon per annum every year in this sort of drawdown. But nature and we, because of emissions, are increasing more than that. In fact, we're adding 130 billion tonnes of carbon per annum to the atmosphere each year. So what we've really got here, very clearly, we've got a deficit of 10 billion tonnes of carbon per annum that we have to draw down. But that will just, of course, if we did that, that would just flatline carbon at stable, CO2 at stable level, wouldn't it? It would just stabilise what we are. So if we're going to basically reduce carbon, we've got to do more than that. We've got to draw down another, just say 10 billion tonnes. So we've got billion tonnes of carbon per annum. So we'll just say we've got to do 20 billion tonnes carbon to get carbon going down. But the really important message, the really key thing, is not, and we're talking with the IPCC and all this about this, and yes, it's doable, yes, we can do it. But the really important thing is it's not just to draw it down, but to put it into that soil carbon sponge. Okay, because we must rebuild the hydrology of the planet. And again, this is now the second biggest punchline or take-home message. The first one was regenerate the Earth's soil carbon sponge, but then we've got to regenerate the Earth's hydrology, because it's the Earth's hydrological dynamics that governs 95% of the heat dynamics of this planet. Okay? And CO2, by comparison, governs 3.8% of the heat dynamics of this planet through its component of the greenhouse effect. And we're in a situation now that even if we draw down 20 billion tonnes of CO2, we're not going to be able to sort of save this planet, stop it from overheating, because while the atmosphere contains 750 billion tonnes of carbon, the oceans contain 50 times that quantity. Every bit we draw out of the atmosphere, the oceans will re-equilibrate it to say, thank goodness, I can release some of that CO2 myself. So it might take 1,000 years to get this CO2 going back down. And in the meantime, we can't survive, okay? It's going to overheat. But what we can do, we can naturally, safely cool the planet hydrologically by regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge. So let's talk about that, okay? Because this is quite, not radical, it's all proven science, it's all Climatology 101, but basically it's something that we basically have to really come to terms with, because in the past, we'll put it at the last 50 years, we've just focused on the symptom. We've focused on the blood on the floor, the increased CO2, Charles's curve. We've looked at this business of it going up. We haven't looked at the thing is what is the driving forces, and the fact is, yes, we're 10 billion tonnes of carbon short. It's 120 billion tonnes is what nature does every year. So even 20 billion tonnes is, I mean, it's an effort, but it's not impossible at all. But the point is, it's rebuilding the hydrology of the planet because of the sponge, because of the water. So let's have a look at that sort of whole climate challenge, okay? We've got a planet, and every day 342 watts per metre squared of incident solar radiation comes into the planet. And of course, to have a stable temperature on the planet, we have to have 342 watts going out again. Logical, right? And that's the sort of physics of the heat dynamics of the planet. But at the moment, basically, we've got 339 watts per square metre going out. So we're 3 watts short because we've got an enhanced greenhouse effect, not just CO2. We've got an enhanced greenhouse effect that's retaining 3 watts per square metre on the planet. Okay? So, yeah, it's serious, it's very serious. But the point is it's 1% of the incident solar radiation or less. Okay? And we've said 95% of the heat dynamics is governed by water. Okay? 95%. So really the question is, how can we change hydrological processes safely, naturally, to give us that 1%, 3 watts per square metre cooling effect? And that becomes a challenge, it becomes totally doable, and in a sense there are a whole sequence of processes that allow us to do that. And I just wanted to go through those briefly. Obviously there's detailed atmospheric physics behind all of that, but basically just to sort of say yes we can, but also the sponge and the role in it. The first thing, of course, if we have trees or vegetation, green vegetation, it's obviously transpiring water up into the air, isn't it? Okay, so we've got vegetation that's transpiring water. For 1 gram of water to go from liquid to gas takes 590 calories of energy per gram to turn that liquid into gas. That's a latent heat of vaporization. So for every gram of water that goes up, we have to take heat from the Earth's surface. We have to cool the Earth's surface naturally, 590 calories. Okay? This process of latent heat fluxes naturally takes 24% of the incident solar radiation, of some 85 watts per square metre, from the surface back up into the air from where it dissipates back out to space. We have to cool the planet 3 watts per square metre. Okay? So 5% increase in latent heat fluxes can do it. 5% increase in transpiration evaporative fluxes can do it. But it can't do it unless we have a sponge. Okay? Because if there's no sponge, there's no water to do that with. Okay? And so this is really the powerful message that, yes, nature has these processes, but unless we actually have the sponge, unless we restore the sponge, we can't do this cooling. There's a whole lot of other sequences in this effect. I mean, basically, once the water vapour is there, it's forming haze particles, and then it'll form clouds. These hazes form clouds. These clouds automatically, basically, are dense, high albedo. So you have what's called an albedo effect on the clouds, which means that these clouds reflect incident solar radiation straight back out to space. Okay, so it's basically just, big reflector. They reflect 120 watts per square metre back out to space, about 1/3 of the incident solar radiation coming into the Earth. Okay, we have to sort of cool this planet 1%.
Are you arguing to increase the cloud cover?
Right, 50% of the Earth is covered with clouds at any one time. 50% of the area. The amount of cloud cover and the density and the reflectivity of the cloud cover is dependent on how much water is going up
Yes, that's
and how well it nucleates into cloud condensation nuclei. Without the sponge, without this transpiration, yes, we lose cloud. If we restore the cloud, I should say, cloud cover has been dropping. It used to be not a third, it used to be 38%. So we've been having less and less cloud because we've been aridifying, desertifying our landmass. I should tell you this now, I mean it's an ugly figure. There's 13.9 billion hectares of land on this planet. That's finite. Well, not finite, actually, some of it's going to go under with sea level rise, right? 13.9 billion hectares of land. We, humans, in the last 8,000 years, have created 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland. The Sahara, Australia, Middle East, Gobi Desert, parts of southwest US. 5 billion hectares, some 40% of the Earth's land surface in the last 10,000 years, we have desertified, we have degraded, right? But it's all able to be regenerated. It all has to have the sponge to regenerate. Okay? But these are the sort of fundamental forces in terms of the climate debate we've never talked about. Because we've just focused on the symptom, the CO2, and cleaning up the CO2, rather than saying, look, what have we done to that whole hydrological dynamics and its governing role in climate, but more importantly, what can we do to regenerate, to restore it? The take-home message again, regenerate the Earth's soil, carbon, sponge. We say, let's say that 55 times in the talk. It's Are you counting? How many talking about that? Okay, so same story. If we increase the cloudiness, just 2%, we can offset that 3 watts per square metre. But we're not doing it artificially, we're just doing it absolutely naturally, as she did, simply by increasing sponge, transpiration green, and basically letting this natural process happen. Okay? So powerful, natural, safe, buffered, regenerative processes, all hinging on the sponge. There's another fundamental process which is even more powerful than all this, and so, it's getting serious now. If we have vegetation, obviously you can see the sun coming into that, and there's albedo reflectance of the surface, but basically this surface, especially when it's taking heat from the surface and transpiring, it's mostly cool. And this soil here, it rarely gets above 20 degrees centigrade, right? So basically under vegetation, a sheltered soil rarely gets above 20 degrees centigrade, even tropical areas. In your climate here, it's mostly 15, 18, unless you've got what we're talking about now. But if you have bare soil, if you clear vegetation and you end up with bare soil, here's brown, let's do that. Here's brown, oh nice, here's a brown bare soil, fallowed soil. We know when the sun hits that soil will hit up to 60 degrees centigrade, right?
Wow.
We can't walk it.
140 Fahrenheit.
140 Fahrenheit. We can't walk on it, we can fry eggs on it. I mean, if it was a metal plate or rock. But the point is that sun heats up. I mean, because of that bare exposed surface, it heats up. And we know that because that's a heat island effect. All our cities, all the concrete, the asphalt, all the hard surfaces, cities are 10 degrees warmer than their surrounding vegetation, landscapes, because of this heat island, because of that heating effect. But this is actually a fundamentally important thing as well, because we know that everything that heats up re-radiates heat. Everything, the Earth, operates what we call as a black body radiator. Simple physics, right? Simple thermodynamic physics. And there's another simple law of thermodynamics, and I don't want to get into the science of it, but it's very simple, that the amount of re-radiation, the amount of heat coming back off a surface, is governed by the constant times the fourth power of the temperature in degrees Kelvin. Now that's technical talk. But what it means is the amount of heat coming off the surface is the fourth power of the temperature difference. That's temperature times temperature times temperature times temperature, expressed in degrees Kelvin. Right? And so that means that a hot, fallowed, hard surface will re-radiate massively more heat back into the atmosphere than if you have a cool, moist, sheltered forest or woodland or whatever, right? So massively increased re-radiation of heat.
Almost twice as much.
Yeah, because basically this relationship, heat goes in, heat must come up. And that, in a sense, is something, again, we have to face. I'll get a new piece of paper because it's pretty important. Because there's three parameters that govern the greenhouse effect, right? So the natural greenhouse effect is driven by three parameters. The first one is the amount of re-radiation going up. It's like the heat on the stove. Is it stove turned on to full, massive heat re-radiation, or is it turned on to simmer? Okay? That's the first one, is the amount of re-radiation. Is it full or simmer? The second heat parameter is the amount of water vapor molecules in the air, right? How much water vapor molecule is in the air. Because this governs most of the greenhouse absorption. So it's the heat going up, and then it's how much of that heat is absorbed by the gas molecules in the air. And water vapor is by far the most dominant greenhouse gas. Okay? And the third variable is the CO2 concentration in the air. This does about 60 to 80%. This does about 20% of the gas absorption. Water, though, is extremely variable, right? It varies so much in time and space and what have you. So it's almost impossible to model, to sort of mathematically predict. But CO2 is very predictable, and so we just focused on number 3. And so really what's happened is our whole focus on the greenhouse effect, but also our whole focus on greenhouse reduction, emissions, control, has been on variable number 3. And the proposition that we're putting, or the question we're asking you, or asking to consider, is we can effectively turn down the heat. You can turn down the heat because it's you, land managers, farmers, graziers, communities, that govern whether your landscape is at 20 degrees or 60 degrees. It's you that govern whether it's a sponge, whether it's cooling, or whether it's just baking. Okay? So you can go to the valley to the east of here, producing 40% of the US food. You ask yourself, how hot does it get? How much bare soil has it got? How much sponge has it got? How much resilience has it got? And what happens if it goes?
Well, it's not just the physical space of the soil, because if you're talking about organic molecules, you're also talking about energy caught up in chemical bonds in those complex.
Yes, certainly there's energy to create those bed springs that I drew there, absolutely, yeah. So basically what we've got here, you're absolutely right, like the sunshine to make sugar is sort of fixing energy, and then actually the fungi that make these stable soil carbons are actually sort of basically turning this sugar, these lignins, these celluloses into much more complex, polymerized stable soil carbon. We won't go into the biochemistry of it, but in that they're storing even more energy, right? So these have got high energy. So really, we've really got stored solar energy creating nothing in soil to create healthy soils, right? So healthy soils are simply mineral detritus plus stored solar energy plus nothing. But it's a bit bit wacko, isn't it? Nature. Okay, so what we had here, you see, we had this sort of thing that basically we now have this question, audacious perhaps, but can we actually slow down, turn down the greenhouse effect? Simply by basically saying, look, we can stop that re-radiation of heat energy by keeping our soils, our landscapes cooler, moister, vegetated, naturally healthy. And the answer is yes, we can. And obviously all the physics, all the stuff, I mean, we could talk for hours about the details of it, but yes, we can. And I'm saying instead of just being fixated on number 3, just instead of just looking at this as a variable where we've been stuck for the last 50 years, simply looking at this, cleaning up the blood on the floor, no, we can actually heal the patient. We can stop the bleeding, we can heal the patient, we can make healthy soils. Right, there's one more thing that we have to do though, because as we said, we've got a sponge, but a sponge obviously is no good without water, is it? Because, hey, a dry sponge doesn't help us at all. So now we've got this challenge, we've got these clouds, and of course those contain vast quantities of water. And there's another factor that came through Qatar on the way here, and basically, see, Qatar, it's desert, it basically gets 80 millimetres of rainfall a year, but it gets 70 times. I mean, 70 times its annual rainfall flows across Qatar every day in humid, moist air. Okay? And so the question isn't basically how much rain we get, but how much of that humid air we actually harvest as rain. Okay? And it'll come back to California because you're exactly the same situation. So the question is, how much rain do we get out of our air? You know, what are the processes that turn clouds into rain? Okay? And it's really quite significant. Again, I'll keep it very simple because basically it's a very complex, but elegant, beautiful system. 3 things make raindrops, because you can't get clouds or can't get water out of the air unless you've got a thing called precipitation nuclei. Okay? The cloud droplets are far too small, scattered, and sort of repulsive, each repelling each other, to fall out under gravity. And basically you've got to take about 1 million cloud droplets to make a raindrop. But to do that, you've got to coalesce them. You've got to hygroscopically suck them in to coalesce them to make a raindrop. And 3 things make raindrops, only 3 things. You've got, 1 is ice. So if you have ice crystals, so if you're in high latitudes, high altitudes, as you go up, it gets colder, you form ice, and obviously when we have a glass of scotch or whatever, then obviously water condenses on the outside of a cold glass because it's hygroscopic. So ice crystals are critically in high latitudes, high altitudes of forming raindrops. The other thing over the oceans are critically important too is salt. And of course you get wind and you get waves and sea spray, and if we get salt in the air, and again salt is very hygroscopic, and of course that creates rain, right? Because they will coalesce 1 million cloud droplets into a raindrop. And of course we do this when we do cloud seeding, right? In America, China, Australia, Israel, we've been researching cloud seeding for decades. Very effective, we can get 30% increased rain. But basically we've been using silver iodide, as again salts that are very hygroscopic to nucleate rain to increase rainfall. People in Colorado Springs are doing this all the time. But by far the most important, and the most naturally important in tropical and inland areas, and by far the most effective at nucleating rain, another group called bacteria, hygroscopic bacteria. And Louis Pasteur wrote all about these. He discovered them because that was part of his whole research on, hey, there's bacteria, these living things in this air, because they spoil his broth, they spoil his soup. And then he did experiments with what are these living things. And of course, these bacteria, again, are highly hygroscopic, and they're very, very effective at bringing cloud microdroplets to form raindrops. They're called Aerobacter aerogenes. It's Louis' word. Aerobacter is logical enough. Aerogery in Greek means we don't know what they're doing there. Okay? And basically these bacteria are really the key things that form 50% of the planet's rain in tropical and inland areas. Now the question is, hey, where do they come from? What makes these bacteria? And of course straight away nature answers itself, because bacteria like you and me need to eat. And what do they eat? They eat sugars, right? They eat these things. Okay, sugars. And so the only thing is, where are the sugars in the universe? Where are the free sugars in the universe? There's only one place where there's free sugars in the universe, in the stomatal cavity of leaves. Because it's the leaves of the sugar factories. And so what these things, they grow in the stomatal cavity, not of all leaves, of certain leaves, trees, certain trees, and basically they go up, as we have here, they go up as part of the transpiration stream. Okay, so there's a transpiration going up, and a lot of this transpiration is bacteria. 50% of the Amazon rainfall, we've done radio label studies, absolutely, over 50% is absolutely directly related to these microbial precipitation nuclei coming up from the forest.
So
Okay?
you're arguing that, like, we've lost maybe 70% of our forests to bad management, and looks like we're going to lose more.
Yep.
And indeed, we need to return to that kind of an equation, which I totally agree with. A lot of the problems out of that, of course, are policy problems.
Absolutely. I don't know if you can all see it on it, but this is a country you might know about. Every dot on this map represents 25,000 hectares, no, sorry, 25,000 acres of forest. This says 1620, 1850, 1920.
Wow.
Yep, I know the figure.
Okay, I can pass it around, but the point is that you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. We have, what we've done to this planet, I've talked about the 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland that is now at 60 degrees re-radiating. Absolutely.
That's true.
The lack of forest that is driving these latent heat fluxes, lack of forest that is driving these precipitation
You
nuclei.
could flip the albedo that way.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, there's a whole. Yes, there's all sorts of other. Nature's complex. There's a whole lot of other processes. I'm just trying to sort of focus on the several key ones, because otherwise we'll be here for 4 hours talking about the physics. But the point is that you're absolutely right. What we have done to this planet, to the land systems on the planet, fundamentally important in their climate. But more powerful, what you're saying, if we regenerate these systems, if we basically use our grassroots community regenerative capacity to rebuild that sponge, to rebuild those forests, to rebuild these hydrological cycles, we've got a future.
In that case, then, we get to a position where we give more back to the life web than we take.
Absolutely.
That's the total.
Yeah, we can bring back that whole life web. We can turn what California was when we're reading about it. I was shown a book over there, The Garden of Eden, that was 400 years ago. When, basically.
But that's very hard going if you look what happened in the Central Valley of California.
Not if we rebuild the sponge. Not if we basically do that very simple thing of basically how do we can go into a lot of practical discussions on rebuilding the sponge.
That's a policy matter.
No, I don't want to disagree with you, but I will. The point is that it's up to us. It's grassroots, community action, ownership.
You're right.
Because
We plant.
politicians,
We
they're
plant.
Yeah. See, I mean, I come from Australia,
That's correct.
rude, but all you get is bullshit. Bullshit's good fertilizer, but it's up to us that have to grow the stuff, right? Because no politician's ever grown something.
No doubt.
You've had a politician, of course, who said what we said back, 90 years ago. Roosevelt, Dust Bowl. A nation that destroys its soils destroys itself.
Correct.
He was on the money. Okay, so basically, I just wanted to quickly get into the rain story, because I just wanted to finish that, because that was very important. Okay, so it's these bacteria, this nucleation of this water, because what do we need that rain for? We need that for our sponge. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, what we've done is we've talked about, Didi's experiment or demonstration. We've sort of said, look, there's the sort of physics, that's why that bread or that sponge really works. And in a sense, what we've been trying to talk about, that sponge is now critical to rebuilding not just our water, our food, our biosystems, our social stability, but actually restoring and cooling the climate. The only mechanism we've got to cool the climate. And that's really what we have to do. And really, as we've had this last discussion very valuably, that locus for action is with us. Grassroots, farmers, land managers, communities saying, okay, what do we do?
So true.
Okay, is that about right, Didi?
Yeah, so we're gonna, that is about right.
Thank you.
One of the things that I've learned in learning how to learn and teach is that when we get a big load of information, it's really helpful to take a moment to let it sink in. So we're going to take a minute to just be quiet and let this sink in. Thank you. And the other thing I've learned is that we don't learn just by listening, that many of us, or all of us, we're not just an intake valve, we need to let it out. So I'm going to invite you to take a moment to turn to one or two people near you and to talk about what you just heard. What does it make you think of? And think about what is the opportunity here and what questions do you have? What's your question? Okay, so just take a couple minutes. So I'd like it if we could do a quick and efficient go around. Your name, if there's one organization you want to identify yourself with, you could say the name of the organization, not the whole mission statement. And what do you see as the opportunity here? And if you have a question that's forming, to ask the question also efficiently, a sentence.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Jill Plaquemine, Rise of Terra, and we were talking about how does this make us feel, and so one of the things I would say is that I'm still really optimistic, and I think that we can make changes. I don't see any reason why we can't. I know we've changed. I mean, you're from the East Coast. We have changed acid rain. Farmers now have to use sulfur because we mitigated acid rain, and that was 20 years ago, so I don't see any reason why we can't do some more work and mitigate some other circumstances. So I'm optimistic.
My name is William Mutch. I'm with Transition Palo Alto, part of the Transition Town community. It's really, really exciting. I mean, well, so when I see this graphic that's going around, that's absolutely terrifying, right? And hearing the cries of we must cut faster, we're not cutting fast, and it's like, oh my God, really? But then, hearing this and just all of the things that we're discovering, everything that we're learning about the soil, and just it's such a living learning edge. you know, and just with your example with the bread, the flour versus the bread, that's going to end up in my lessons when I'm teaching. And even though I've also been teaching this stuff for a little while, you notice all the new little things that you learn along the way, picking it up from other teachers. It's just lovely. So.
Evan Watson, and I'm from Tomcat Ranch, which is over kind of past Andrews a little bit. I don't know yet.
Spencer Smith with the Savory Institute, and I really like this approach because oftentimes when we talk about carbon, it's so abstract and people can't really wrap their hands around what that means. However, in California, people really do resonate with water quality, water quantity, and our food system. So if we can, the climate change, the carbon question, the food quality question, the water question are all one and the same. So if we can meet different parts of our constituency and the group that we interact with like this, everybody will have a different resonance. And I think, I like Jill, I am totally confident that this is a problem that we can put in history books if we knuckle down to it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lisa Stokey, and I'm here from Massachusetts, actually. And I'm a founder of the nonprofit organization next7.org. It's about reorienting our focus to the next 7 generations. It's about these kinds of solutions we're talking about. I'm also a co-founder of Food Democracy now, and I'm on the board of the Real Organic Project. And we're working on these issues that Spence was just talking about, of using agriculture as much as it's been, the problem, and I've spent a lot of my time raising the awareness of the problem. I also believe that recognized and it's supported by science, of course, that it can be the biggest part of the solution. So that's what I'm working on with Real Food Campaign with Dan right here. You're up.
My name is Dan Kittredge. I'm the Executive Director of the Bionutrient Food Association. Our mission is increasing quality in the food supply, which is correlated with flavor and aroma and health-giving attribute, which correlates with all these kinds of things and good economic drivers. I'm thoroughly confident we can pull this thing off. I appreciate Walter's information and get specific questions for him about which plants are the ones that make the microbes that go into the atmosphere. I keep saying we need more trees around here. And how do we flock into the soil so trees will germinate? There are trees in some places. I think it's entirely possible to do this. I'm really excited.
I'm Larry Nunes, and I'm here at Paicines Ranch, and I really appreciate Walter's approach in going through biotic and abiotic, the richness of the conversation. I think is giving me a really awesome feeling of empowerment.
My name is Keith Brennan. I work here at the ranch. Much better listener than speaker, so.
I'm Paul Payne. I'm a local organic farmer, walnuts, poultry, various things down in Trespinas, so a neighbor of the ranch. And I want to compliment our speaker. I think what really opened my eyes a number of years ago was when Dr. Christine Jones was here, and we got an opportunity to listen to her for a couple of days, and it just really opened our eyes about how soil works.
I'm on?
Yeah.
I'm Jack Varian. I'm a cattle rancher from southern Monterey County, about 100 miles south of here. And I'd like to tell you how I make my decisions on managing the ranch. It's very simple. If I speed water up, I've made a bad decision. If I slow it down, I made a good decision. That's it.
I'm Zara Varian, and in June will be 60 years with this guy. He's a pretty smart guy, and I'm right behind him.
market as manager there and also on the planning committee for EcoFarm. I find it fascinating that this conversation is going on everywhere I go, and it's really exciting to see it mainstream through, and how we mainstream that to the general public would be my question as to moving forward.
My name is Lydia Nielsen, and I am a permaculture teacher, and I have a company called Rehydrate the Earth. I do residential permaculture design, and we focus on earth contouring and adding organic matter to get water to infiltrate, and then planting vegetation to get that water to cycle. So this is so great. I'm so glad I made the drive after a long day of work to come out here and just get all the details that Walter just shared with us. It's super exciting and really validating.
My name is Anne Trywald, and I'm visiting permaculture with Lydia, and I'm a friend of hers, and I live a quarter-acre in Santa Cruz, and I got really into soil and different types of plants when I acquired my home, and I'm a community organizer, I guess, and teacher at Microbial College in Santa Cruz, and I don't know how exactly I would apply this, but in that regard, but I'm really excited. It's a great presentation, really awesome. Thank you for Walter. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Gimmerin, and I live in San Jose, the valley here, and I want to thank you all for coming and sharing with us. One of the first things that top of mind that comes to me with this is Walter, is being able to pull some of these ideas together. I'm learning so that then I can share and teach others, and that's where my focus is. So thank you.
My name is Bob Knight. I'm a farmer in Southern California, old growth orange. I was really encouraged to hear that there's so many other points of approach to work on these climate problems besides just CO2. And Walter, I was really pleased with the simplicity and clarity of this storyline that makes it so easy to go and inoculate the other communities that we belong to. So I think that's very beautiful.
My name is Jesse Smith, and I'm with Kiss the Ground as well as Terragenesis International, and I also really appreciate the simplicity in which the concept around trees creating rain was articulated. It's something that I've felt deep down for my whole life, and in the consulting world that I work in, trying to explain to farmers in the Central Valley that they actually should be investing in forests along the coastline is something that is rolled off my tongue a few times, and now I might have some backing to be able to explain why that should be happening. So I'm also really interested in what are the trees that hold the bacteria that create the raindrops.
My name is Ben Cook, and I just work for a local landscaping company in Palo Alto, California, and I guess for me, I really thought it was interesting about, reinvigorating, of course creating a sponge, but also, adhering pretty closely to, that specific environment and kind of replacing the same sort of plants as far as, once there's a sponge established, really just kind of keeping with that kind of climate and geography and environment. And I guess what really hit home, or something I want to understand more about, is the release of bacteria, like the sponges, and that as well.
I'm Peter Donovan with the Soil Carbon Coalition, and my question is how we can, and I think this kind of presentation and information and synthesis that Walter provides helps us ask better questions. And also, I think will engage us in finding more people to ask as well as answer those questions in a very participatory manner.
I'm Darshana Greenfield. I'm a homeowner in Menlo Park and working to put a food forest in my front and backyard of my small property. And I'm a writer, and I love to share information and try to inspire other people, so I love having more information about using natural methods to reinvigorate and keep our soil and to plant more trees. So thank you so much. I'm Cynthia Travis. Did you want our questions now or in the second round? Okay. I live up on the Mendocino coast, and I'm passionate about all things related to climate and ecological restoration, and particularly with regard to peace building. So I'm in a deep exploration of the connections between soil health, gut health, and peace. And so my question, I have a two-part question. Part one is best guess of if we were to go full tilt on this, kind of where we are on time continuum. Like how quickly can you imagine that this could occur? And the second question is a concern about water use for tree planting. And it comes up a lot when I talk to people about reforestation. But we already don't have enough water. How are we going to water our trees? And Sally and I were just talking about that too. So I'm wondering. Thanks.
Sally Calhoun from the Paicines Ranch. And I'm really happy to have another argument for why bare ground is a terrible idea. Olivia Boyce-Abel, Boyce-Abel Associates and Family Lands Consulting. And I'm delighted because I've been an organic gardener for the last 30 years and been growing things, and all my life intuitively I've understood what you just said. But I could never get the bacteria part. But I knew that in the Amazon, and I knew that places where there were lots of trees, there's a lot more moisture, everything's viable and alive, and I'm delighted. So, yeah, and what kind of trees, if something does it faster, or if it's just everything. So, thank you.
Elaine? I'm Elaine Paderini here at Paicines Ranch, and I also work with something called the No Regrets Initiative, where we are looking at how you move all your resources into building the soil sponge. And the questions I had were well articulated already, and one remaining one is the brain trust, the intelligence in this room right now is so huge, and if we could tap into this and also have more and more of these incredible circles come together, how fast could we make this happen, and what would be the places where we could make that happen?
My name's Newton Harrison. I'm a founding director of a group at UC Santa Cruz called the Center for the Study of the Force Majeure. We see the force majeure as three forces, which is the rising of water, the rising of heat, and the possible sixth extinction, which we appear to be moving toward. Our center sets out at the largest possible scale to look at these kind of problems and counter-propose. I find I don't disagree with you in any case at all.
Let's have discussions on something else.
Yeah, you see, I think you're right in all cases. However, one of our plans is to deal with 1 million square kilometers and rehydrating Europe, because the drought's coming there, and civil strife will happen in 50 years. And so we're artists and thinkers and scientists as well, and we're doing that kind of design. But it's staggering because we subtract so much, and that what you're trying, the way you propose it is there's two parts to your proposal. One of them is how do we return hydration to the soil? I mean, as I said, we lost two-thirds of our trees. But the other part of it is how do we enact the kind of change necessary in time? I got my doubts, but I'm not going to act on the doubts. I'm going to act in the other way. So,
and I'll have a good argument with you because I think we've got about 10 years, not 50 years.
Well, true, but also we've got like 10 million square miles of farming. That means we've got 10 million square miles of biodiversity reduction, as well as sponge reduction, as well as a bunch of other things. So the the herd of elephants in the room is probably population.
I'm David McConville, work with Newton a bit, also have a studio called Spherical, and then chair the Buckminster Fuller Institute. A lot of my focus is on how we actually communicate planetary cycles and understand how we cooperate with planetary cycles and each other. And I'm really interested in Walter's work in particular, very resonant with a lot of the work that Newton's doing and these, what they call them in Dune, planetologists?
Imperial planetologists.
Imperial planetologists, you know, like looking for the people that really can help us to reshape the way that we're understanding the functioning of our planetary system so that we can communicate these things like what you're saying about water and the relation to climate that I think is largely unknown, but absolutely critical to communicate that more effectively.
I'm Dawn Danby. I work with David at Spherical on a number of things. I think one of the things that we do is try to bring a better understanding as we increase our understanding of planetary systems, try to bring that to other audiences and other communities. So we work, I've spent most of my career in design and technology communities, and you encounter extraordinary ignorance about ecological systems there. And so that's part of our work, is trying to communicate that. But one of the things that was very resonant for me in hearing your presentation is there's, the part of it that is basic systems understanding, the kind of thing that when my daughter comes to me and says, where does rain come from? I should be able to answer that very quickly, very simply. I could not have answered that before today. And that level of simplicity and that basic level of understanding is just as relevant to basically the entire tech industry as it is to the 5-year-olds. So thank you.
My name is Mary Shaw Koran. I worked on a local initiative, Measure J, which is to ban fracking, and also helped with Measure Z in Monterey County. But we also were shifting towards renewables, and I worked on community choice energy. So my focus has really been on the problem with climate change and how we shift off of fossil fuel, but I didn't feel like that was adequate, and I took a class that Sally had with Christine Jones, I think someone else mentioned her name, and it made me realize that really soil is really important in terms of tackling climate change. And for me that was really inspiring, because I went to a UCSC conference with these brilliant PhDs who were talking about, I think it's various ways to tackle climate change. It was really like the suggestions were crazy, geoengineering, polluting more to protect us from all this pollution. So, and there seems like there's a lot of despair out there among people who are in the climate movement. I guess I consider myself part of that. And there's even people, really brilliant people, Stephen Hawking, the founder of Tesla, who talk about how we should all move to Mars, and that's the solution. And so I find this really inspiring, the fact that it gives me hope that we can restore and heal this planet, and that it actually is quite doable. So thank you so much for making this more scientific. And I knew that planting trees and restoring the soil would be great, but this is really nice to have the science behind it.
My name is Andy Shaw-Koran, and although my background was in marine biology and ecology, I spent 20 years teaching in the prison system, and I was a union official. And I'm really interested in the human dimension of this issue, which is, how do you create the democratic forces that, just because you have a solution out there, doesn't move you any closer to solving the problem. I mean, Michael Moore attempted to do that with his Where to Invade Next, showed people a bunch of solutions, none of which we've moved any closer to. As a matter of fact, we've moved further from them in this country.
Sometimes.
Yes, and so the generating those democratic forces, whether it's partly the education that you're doing right now to give people some hope that they are there, and then the other issue is, how do we channel the economic forces so that people's work is associated with this restorative effort? Because you hear the Silicon Valley crowd talking about giving people pay to do nothing when there's so much work to do. And more work than we can imagine. And that seems, again, insane. And that brings us back to Franklin Roosevelt and the idea that, you bring together those two issues, the environment that needs healing and the people that need work.
Hi, my name is Ann Stauffer. I'm with the Soils Committee of the Loma Prieta chapter of Sierra Club. And I guess the thing that always strikes me is, and Walter talked about it, is this isn't anything new. It's just simple. So I always think about that. But one thing I think that I did learn, or I relearned when I first got into soil, is how is the connection of soil to everything else. Like soil's connected to water, which is connected back to soil, which is connected to food, and then which is connected to people, right? And microorganisms and everything else. I think the thing that I would like to see improved is this connection between people and like farmers. Like farmers is like one of the biggest connections. I'm so glad there's farmers here. I grew up in the Central Valley, so I have kind of a mix of a life experience. But I think that is like just absolutely critical to having a movement. And I think farmers in general need a lot of help. I mean, they need financial assistance to make like transitions into what I call regenerative agriculture. So that's what I'd like to see happen, is just this really a lot of assistance that way, and education. Thank you.
My name is Linky. I'm with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, but I'm not representing the agency today. I'm just here for myself. I think like in the past few years, the agency has put in a huge focus on soil health, and we have a lot of programs. We have our soil health initiative and focusing on like educating the agricultural community about soil health. And I'm here mainly, I want to hear all the perspectives and also learn from other people on how to approach in terms of reaching out to the community and just kind of learn more myself. So it's very inspiring to hear the presenter talk about like the ways how they do the demonstration from Didi, and also like the diagrams and how you explain about how the connection of the water, the cloud, and the bacteria and all that. So I think those are all great tools, I think, like for me to learn and potentially have an explanation to when I'm trying to talk to people that I work with too. And one of the questions I have is, I think I might have missed something here too, about the bacteria. I think there's a lot of focus on trees, but in California there are a lot of landscapes we don't have. It's not necessarily suitable for trees. So I'm curious on like areas like you have landscapes that's not suitable for trees. What about like other plants? There are just a whole bunch of other plants, grasses, forks, and shrubs. So it's not necessarily have to be trees. The idea is for soil health is to have the land covered, right? Have vegetation covered, right? So I just wondering about that.
My name is Donnie Whitten. I work here at Paicines Ranch. I've been farming and ranching all of my adult life, for the most part. And I'm really optimistic. Probably for the last 30 years, I've been working on managing livestock and soils and how to create, the sponge. And just like you said, it's so simple, yet it's very hard to do. And not because of, I think it has more to do with social things than the physical thing to make it happen. But I've seen in the last 10 years, I think, an incredible boost towards the the knowledge, the acceptance, and the optimism that, you know, we can do this. So yeah, I'm optimistic.
My name is Kelly. I'm the studio manager. I work with Newton Harrison at the Center for the Study of the Force Majeure, which is an art science organization. I'm also a trained biologist, filmmaker, and designer, so I'm a hybrid. And yeah, my biggest thing too is how do we actually organize at a large enough scale to do this work that he presented so clearly. I have a very specific question. Some of the numbers, like we only need to do a 5% increase in the latent heat fluxes and things like that. They're really inspiring because it feels like, okay, that we can do that, you know. So my question is, you also mentioned that 5 billion hectares of man-made desert are out there. I'm sure there's probably studies about how many hectares we need to regenerate the carbon sponge in order to get that 5%. And so just knowing that number might be a useful thing for us all to go out and present to people, because it could maybe bring us together around that number. If we can put these many hectares of land together through our networks to actually do it, you know, that would be amazing. So yeah, just that organizing piece.
And my name is Tim. I run a company called the Philosopher's Stone Ground. We create a line of nut butters that are really seeking to nourish organisms and ecosystems and creating products that promote the health of the whole. So one of the things that I'm interested in is how do we actually proliferate regenerative templates to rebuild this sponge through our supply chain. Specifically, we make almond butters, and one of the things that I would be really interested to see is how do we shift 1 billion acres of almonds that are planted in California from draining aquifers to actually recharging them and creating more rain in the Central Valley.
That's a great question.
I'm Courtney Heron, and I'm up here this weekend just learning about nutrient-dense food and farming. I'm actually shifting from a career in real estate in the city to learning about farming and where I fit in, and just really learning how farming can actually make a difference in environmental restoration and where I fit into that. So just here learning, and it's nice to be amongst all these people who are all doing the same thing. Thank you.
What I think is an opportunity here in California is to have a bunch more of these gatherings, to swell this into a movement of people getting to know each other, figuring out how to facilitate these things so that it's not just an expert giving you information that you go home and go, wow, he's really smart. And then just keep going with whatever you're doing. Like we want to figure out how to inspire people, help people get to know each other, say, hey, we had an almond farmer yesterday, a conventional almond farmer who wants to figure out how to do this. Can I introduce you? Yeah. So to start building that living matrix, which is very much like that living soil sponge, out of these gatherings. So for that, some of the things that I see that are needed, we need people who are willing to what's the word? Convene. Okay. People willing to convene them, people willing to host them, so spaces, farms, places, convention halls, whatever, though this is a great size right here, to people willing to host them in terms of the physical space, some funding, it doesn't need to be huge amounts, but some funding to help people who can't take a couple days off of work to come to something, and then you know, we're planning to spend the next 12 months putting this into handbooks, written documents, things where we can really explain these processes. So help with that on any number of levels, whether it's editing videos, helping to fund some of that time, helping to edit materials, etc. There's lots to do there. So those are some of the opportunities that I see, and I'm going to turn it back to Walter. I think what I see here is maybe the California coastline picture coming up.
No, look, okay. Well, look, thank you very much, and really thank you very much for it's two-way direction, because really it's you guys that are important people. And a lot of good questions, a lot of good questions. And obviously the first thing I have to say is, we don't know it all, right? I mean, simple as that. There's details. We have a lot of knowledge. A lot of knowledge comes from you guys, farmers, innovative farmers doing things, case studies of stuff. But we have just as many questions as you do, because there's always more to know, right? Like Mother Nature, this whole thing is pretty sophisticated. In terms of, the question, like the bacteria, I mean, Louis Pasteur set that thing up, sort of wrote a textbook back in the 1880s on aerobiology, and, as you would, and basically, outlined the thing, but the practical thing, of course, was never raised, you see, how can we do it? We got into it, I was in CSIRO, that's our Australian Premier Government Research and our atmospheric people there, and we were looking at cloud seeding, and we were using then silver iodide and all the different things, including bacteria. And in cloud chambers, there's no question that these bacteria were way, way ahead of anything else in nucleating, but we didn't have the physics to atomise bacteria into the atmosphere, right? When you grow bacteria, get glug, and you can't atomise them. We can do that now. But the point is that, so these questions about how to do it, then the other question that was asked, Dan and stuff, well, what species, what area? And again, we've got a lot of information, but we can't give you a definitive species list because it's species, age, site, under what conditions, etc. And so it's much more complex. There's about 20 really stunning case studies around the world where people have done that. I mean, and it's old hat, as somebody sort of said, it's old hat. There's 2 islands in the Atlantic Ocean, Ascension Island and St Helena. The British used them as staging posts when they still had sailing ships and ruled the seas. And basically they put goats on those islands to provision their ships as they went around the world. And of course, goats do, they just ate everything and just destroyed the islands. And so in about 1870, Charles Darwin, you might know this guy, and Hooker, who was the president of the Royal Society, said we've got to do something about Ascension Island. So they did an experiment, as they would, they were scientists, you see, and they've got 2 islands on Ascension Island, Bald Island and Green Island. Green Island, of course, they artificially revegetated. Green Island now gets 20% more rainfall than Bald Island. They're still in the same Atlantic Ocean, the same currents, etc., etc. The only trouble is coming back to think what species. There's a whole lot of tropical species, but because they were exotics, now they've got troubles. They've got to clear those things because they're weeds, because they're exotics, aren't they? They're not natural to Ascension Island. See, so, I don't have the answers, except there was an experiment from, like 150 years ago that's telling us something powerful. And there's about, at least a dozen other examples like that. So, no, that's the sort of stuff we have to learn and put together. Because it's very, very important that we don't mislead people, go and do this prescriptively, and of course it doesn't always work. As far as the question, like are grasses and stuff important, generally speaking, there's no evidence that they're causing these bacteria, because when we clear a forest, we crash the rainfall, right? But there's still grass and scrub and other green stuff there. But of course other grasses are still very important in fixing carbon, providing plant cover, providing latent heat fluxes, all that stuff, right? So don't give up on green cover just because you can't verify they're good trees.
Walter, I just want to say there is an article that just came out, however, from citing land in North Dakota where they started using cover crops and comparing it to other ones, that there's a 20% increase in rainfall and also a decrease in temperature.
Absolutely.
So that's not trees.
No, absolutely. That's not trees, but see, that's the point. We don't know if that's aerobacter or if it's just basically cooler surfaces and biotic humid airflow is being captured, right? See, and this is the trouble. This is where the danger is being, saying things scientifically which we haven't confirmed, right?
But if we're looking at results, then
Oh, yeah,
if it wants
effectively.
to rain, then we're done.
Yeah.
We don't need to be picky.
Oh, yes. But okay.
Practicality.
No, okay. But basically, I mean, I'm getting onto the good news, you see, basically it's all around you. And as I sort of said, you know, Qatar, I was there sort of 3 weeks ago, and basically, yeah, you've got all this humid air flowing across most desert areas of the world, and the issue is how we nucleate it. And of course, the same in California. You see, you've got vast area of ocean called the Pacific Ocean, just to the west of you, and every day you've got humid air flows. And basically you've got the ocean, and then you've got the coastal plain, you've got the coastal range, the Central Valley, Sierra Nevada, and then Death Valley, right? And so you've got a constant humid airflow going across, you know, these things. That air has 4% by weight of water in it, right? 4% by weight of water. Considering the volume of air, you know, sort of, you know, 10,000 metres of air flying with 4% water, you'll drown yourself in it, right? If you ever condensed it. But the point is you do, you see, because you've got some exquisite water harvesting thing, because here, just north of here, I mean, I haven't been there, I'd love to be there, have a look, you've got Sequoia sempervirens. Okay, and Sequoia sempervirens gets 70% of its moisture through harvesting these humid airflows, these fogs, these mists. And when you look at the leaves of Sequoia, they've got absolutely stunning condensation fans. Okay, the surfaces of the leaves, they're waxy and they just sort of run off precipitation. Okay, so again, there you are, you're harvesting these humid airflows. The tallest trees in the world, I mean, we had them in Tasmania, then we cut them down, wood chipped them. Now you've got the tallest trees in the world, but that's okay. But the point is, the tallest trees in the world is Sequoia sempervirens. Same thing in Sequoia giganteum on the Sierra Nevada range, right? Those trees live on basically fog and mist and stuff that they're capturing there. Okay? And so there's a whole lot of factors. All your coastal forest was oak, hardwood, shelterwood. And, you know, like driving around now, we're seeing that's like often just scrub and grass, you know, just pastures or whatever. And the question is, how much moisture did that harvest naturally? And when we look at areas where there is a shelter wood and you look at the vegetation under it, yeah, it's a lot greener, the soil's a lot different compared to those open bare grassland. See, so what I'm saying, there's a whole lot of things there in your backyard, and yeah, you can rehydrate California. Not necessarily just the Aerobacter, there's all these other processes that are there naturally, and how do we pick up on those, right? And so, yeah, I just gave you some examples, but actually the whole debate goes into all these other processes as well. So I think it's, as we sort of said, and this is really the important thing, is just having these community empowerment, this community discussion to say, what are you doing about, you know, your habitat, your biosystem, your future? And, you know, like having at that grassroots level of what do we do? Then it comes down to some of our friends with basically saying, look, I've just got a garden, right? Well, fantastic, because every square metre, or okay, you're honest, every square yard of garden, every garden bed, every courtyard, every balcony, you know, everything green, every bit of composting, every bit of vermiculture, it's all basically helping to rebuild the soil carbon sponge, but more importantly, it's building the consciousness in the kids and the community, you know, that it's happening. Okay? The Chinese have got a proverb, we repeated it today repeatedly, when is the best time to plant a tree? And the answer is 20 years ago. And then the answer is, the question is, when's the second best time to plant a tree? And the answer is? Now. Exactly, you see? So forget about 20 years ago, let's just do it. In terms of doing it, the answer says, oh, but hang on, we're empowered, there's all this industrial agriculture, it's so dominant. But you forget, you see, it's you guys that empower. Power comes every time you go and put $1 on a counter or your card into a slot machine. You see, when you buy something, Okay, and so that's when you're voting. You're voting with your dollars as you spend your dollars. And if you sort of discriminate in terms of where you spend your dollars, am I buying food that you know how it was grown, where it was grown, that it has a nutritional integrity, you know, that you can trust. And if you buy that food and not just any generic food, then you are voting for a change. And you have no idea how powerful a community voting with their money is in a capitalistic society. You know, it's the force that drives societies, right? These societies. And so, again, it's awareness, communication, and then starting to discriminate and voting, you know, with your voice, but also voting with your dollars. And then it's the urban agriculture, it's regreening streetscapes, this whole range of activities that all are part of this regreening and rehydration and cooling agenda. But basically, if there's specific questions, I don't want my book here, but is there specific questions, or is that how we want to proceed? Sure. Didi? Yeah, if there are specific questions, I'm happy to try to answer it.
Said one really quick one. You had 20% of natural greenhouse go attributed to CO2, and then 60 to 80 to H2O.
Yep.
So what is the potential other 20%?
Okay, well, you've got also, you know, methanes and nitrous oxide and other things. The problem with, okay, I mean, this is important actually, we've talked about this. See, you ask yourself, well, why haven't we considered this, right? And the answer is that two things. One, water is almost impossible to model mathematically, right? It's so variable in time and space, right? It's there this morning, it's not there this afternoon, it's in this valley, but it's not in that valley. So basically, when Jimmy Carter, President Carter, gave the Scripps Oceanographic Institute and Las Alamos the brief in 1978 to model what is the consequence of the CO2 greenhouse effect to the US future, particularly in agriculture. And when they reported in the report to the President in 2000, to Ronald Reagan, they had to say, well, look, we can't model water mathematically, too hard, and therefore we will stick strictly to the brief. As the President asked, what is the consequence of the rise in CO2 that, you know, Keeling had showed us? So in a sense, it's always the same thing in politics and science. If you set the context on that tunnel, you lock yourself into that tunnel. You've got to be very careful the tunnel doesn't become a black hole. And for 40 years we've been in a black hole. The other reason why they didn't look at water, all climatology 101, every textbook, you know, Trawatha, everybody, water governs 95% of the heat dynamics of the blue planet. Water is far too dominant and powerful in their assumptions that humans could possibly have influenced it. Okay, they weren't elephants in the room, they were far too big to fit in the room. Okay, so water was left as, well, look, that's nature, we're just looking at our consequence on CO2. And so we've been in this black hole, and all I'm just saying, liberate ourselves from it, please. Because as that diagram, I don't know where it is at the moment, but as it's degrading of forest, the desertification of 5 billion hectares, yeah, we have had an impact. Dan?
The 5 billion hectares of desertified land due to human influence.
Yep.
It's something I refer to oftentimes obliquely, not knowing the numbers. That's a massive.
Yeah, it's 40% of the Earth's surface. Yep.
Where do you get that from?
Ruddyman and the United Nations Environment Programme have done all that detailed sort of accounting, and basically that's desert and semi-arid wasteland.
Yeah.
Wasteland. I mean, very simple figures. You see, like 8,000 years ago, there was 8 billion hectares of primary forest, as we saw in that picture of North America, right? We've cleared 6.3 billion hectares of that forest. We now have about 3.5 billion hectares because some is regenerated. And so it goes on with every category. And you do the UNEP, you know, it's all totally documented, totally official. Yeah. And so 5 billion hectares of residual desert and wasteland. The Sahara, Central.
Agriculture, effectively.
Overgrazing, burning and clearing, right? So we've got about 1.5 billion hectares of cropland, and again, basically, Berlin last 2015, I was involved. Basically, we've got about 70% of the soil structure carbon degradation across that 1.5 billion hectares.
That's a whole lot of regeneration.
Oh yeah. But the point, okay, let's go on the positive side. We've got these innovative farmers, that's what I spend most of my time with. Innovative farmers, they're doing up to 10 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum, putting it back in soil. So, Kelly, the question, Kelly was right. Yeah. Kelly asked the question, and the answer is, yeah, look, if we can do 10 tonnes of carbon, and we have a target of 20 billion tonnes drawdown, which I'll be talking in Sweden about in May, then it's 2 billion hectares. So between forest and desert and cropland, totally possible. Totally possible.
There's what, 5 or 7 billion hectares of agricultural land?
Yes, there's 1.5 billion hectares of cropland, and there's about 6 billion hectares of grazing rangeland. Yeah.
Could you just address the question though in terms of the speed when we talk about the hydrological cooling and transpiration, just for example?
Okay.
Or the boats and stuff. That's potentially much faster than trying to affect the climate versus via soil carbon as carbon.
Yeah, okay, well look, I mean, very simple. I mean, we can't change the climate through carbon alone, right? If we just say that we're drawing down CO2 and just say we're putting into dry ice, CO2, it wouldn't change anything, and it would take 1,000 years because, as we said, the ocean will re-equilibrate CO2 back in the air. So it's active, natural, healthy cooling that is critical, and that involves bringing that water, the sponge, and it's really the water in the sponge, the transpiration, and these processes we talked about that gives us a cooling. But the good thing is, we all know that, isn't it? The minute a cloud goes over us, we look for our jumpers. Okay? That cooling happens within a day, not 1,000 years. Okay? The minute we walk from a hot pavement under the shade of cool, moist trees and lie down in the grass, we go from overheating to healthy cooling. That happens instantaneously the minute we make that step. So the terms of speed and effectiveness and practicality, hey, it's all there. I've got a the people I work with in Canberra, we've got a project called Cool Canberra. Canberra is Australia's capital city. It was set up 100 years ago. Walter Burley-Griffin, Marion Mahoney came over. It's a landscape city. It was a clapped out, arid, dusty sheep paddock, basically. The first thing they did is they revegetated it, put an urban forest through it, and basically that's created a microclimate, which is Canberra. It's beautiful, but now in that microclimate it's 7 degrees centigrade cooler on a hot summer's day compared to the new suburbs on the fringes, which are outside that shelter belt music environment. 7 degrees centigrade cooler. No air conditioning needed. Absolutely beautiful.
So I'm just trying to understand, as someone who's very concerned about climate change, I mean, people I've talked to seem to think reforestation is very important. Do you have any numbers of how much we should do in order to start making that shift? How rapidly? How many acres?
I have to talk to your Chinese ancestors. You plant a tree now, as many as you can, but we're not talking about reforesting everything because we've got to grow crops as well. Your oak shelter woods, and these are just open, sparse shelter woods. 50 trees per hectare, beautiful parklands, right? Because what's critical is the shade, but most important is dropping the wind speed, the evaporative scouring, the desiccation on the soil surface, right? So, 50 trees per hectare, that's 10 by 20 meters. There's lots of places to play baseball or whatever is in the thing, right? So it's a shelter wood. And of course what you've got in an exquisitely efficient natural ecosystem where you have a tree canopy, you've got sunlight still, you've got a grass understory, and you've got a triple productive system, more palatable grass, more productive grass, more mesic, longevity of green, deep nutrient pumps, I can go on. So nature evolves exquisitely efficient systems, but it doesn't have to be a monoculture forest which becomes its own desert in its own way anyway.
Well, I'm interested in strategies for accelerating succession.
Yeah.
Because I've looked at what they do with this grow oasis thing in dry areas where they concentrate the water onto one spot so a seedling or a seed can grow. But maybe in some cases where we've got really damaged land, maybe we need to use non-native species to get the process going, to build up organic matter so that the native species can
Because if we were non-native and causing the destruction, why do you want to be purist about fixing it, right? Okay, because we're not native. But more importantly, let's get back to California. Yes, we have to accelerate successions. Why? Because you're going to burn, you're going to barbecue yourself, right? You've got aridification, you've got soil degradation, you've lost your snowpack, you've lost your groundwater in the valley, you're going to barbecue yourself, right? Because what you've also done, 1850s, a lot of Californians went to Australia to get some gold. They didn't find much gold, but they came back with eucalypt seeds, right? And you came back with eucalypt seeds and you planted eucalypts, but you didn't bring the eucalypt fungi back, did you? No. So you've got fuel producing 10 tons, 20 tons of fuel per hectare per annum, and so it's just accumulating because you don't have the capacity to break that down in your own microflora.
Are you aware that the original people, Native Americans up in the Sierra Nevada, did exactly that?
And that's what
some of my friends, we work with them up there at the Seychellen Research Station, and they're actually bringing thousands of acres now back to approximately 40 to 50 trees per acre. That would be 80 per hectare.
Whatever's
and they're planting it intelligently so it's not spaced stupidly. And they're yanking out any monoculture. And on top of that, they're introducing, and our group up there, they're introducing managed fire, which is necessary for that.
And absolutely, and that's a shelter wood. And coming back to the fire.
So you just described.
I didn't know about it, sorry.
I'm sure you know it, but what I'm saying is we're forgetting that lots of the stuff he's talking about was known in the fingertips of people who first moved here and lived here. There's a wonderful woman named Kat Anderson who wrote a book called Tending the Wilds. And I know when we were working with it.
No, I agree.
And so I was stunned to hear you say that.
Okay. No, thank you. But just coming back to this eucalypt sort of problem, you see. So now you're going to burn yourself, Hollywood will burn every 3 years, on clockwork. Unless you do exactly what you said. We have to now accelerate the biodegradation of those fuels because it's the only way we can save it. So we've got this really big challenge. It's fire or fungi. It's burn or biodegrade. And if we can accelerate the natural biodegradation of those eucalypt litters into stable soil carbon to make more bed springs, to build more healthy soils, we're turning that negative, disastrous imperative into an opportunity, into a positive win. But it's accelerated natural successions, and in this case it's how do we actually accelerate the fungal breakdown of that litter to turn it back into stable soil carbon. So yeah, absolutely. And weeds, not weeds, but pioneers, site colonisation, jackhammer plants, absolutely critical in this.
Nitrogen fixing
plants. Even if some agronomist has put them on a list and sort of put them down on a weed list, right? You've got to ask, is that real?
Or even a comment on that as herbs. When I moved to my land, it was pretty arid in one area, and I planted salvias close together, and I added compost, put wood chips down and mulched, and now I've got my fruit trees there because there's enough soil built up. So whoever's talking about that before, that's the stage of getting, setting that groundwork.
And we've got no idea how powerful it is. Again, you go to America and you look at America, and basically, again, 9,000 years ago, you have Great Plains, the Central Plains. It was a glacial outwash till, right? It was just gravel, clay, mud, ice, miserable, nothing. In 9,000 years, nature has created the world's most productive prairie soils, 10, 20 metres deep, with 8% carbon, that grow all, big part of your food, your corn belt, etc. And there you go, for 8,000 years, nature has grown that soil to that productivity. And it's just done it with exactly this process. And so again, if nature can do it, we can do it. So it's nothing holding us back.
So can I make a comment on that just a minute while you're doing that? In South Africa, we've taken out the eucalyptus and we took out the pine, and the creek started to flow again and whatnot, and then we did pyrolysis. So then instead of just taking those trees out, we actually went through the process of pyrolysis and created charcoal for people to cook with. So you can repurpose some of those things while you're looking at changing these things. So if you're taking out eucalyptus, the U.S. Forest Service has mobile pyrolysis units, so you can make charcoal out of trees that you take out to change the hydrology.
I was just curious about two things. Like, generally speaking, when you're talking about this field and trying to identify it, Tom Groh and others refer to geotherapy, right? It's like they kind of have a countercourse to the geoengineering mindset. Is there a term that you use to describe what this is? And also, from a scientific perspective, have you looked at some of the claims of Michel Krawczyk about sea level rise and all the water runoff, and what's your take on that?
Okay. Well, look, so first of all, words, yes, there's geotherapy, but basically we want to be more empowering, right? And so it's basically regeneration, revitalization, right? It's the empowerment of communities to regenerate, to revitalize, right? So that's in a sense what we're seeing. And also, I want to get into the actual, focus on here are the natural processes, and all we have to do is get our boot off her throat and let her basically help her do it, right? And so that whole case of that, this is nature, this is how petagenesis works, and basically all we have to do is open our eyes, understand, and then create the opportunity, facilitate. There's another whole dilemma, a whole dimension to talk about sea level rise, and obviously if we rebuild the soil carbon sponge, then can we help reverse or mitigate or slow down sea level rise? And obviously it's just simple logic, right? Because if we can rehydrate our soils to say to 2 meters depth, if there's 60% airspace, nothing in these soils, even if we fill, to say, a quarter of that with water, we should be able to sort of say, look, here's 30 centimetres of water across 13 billion hectares of land surface, technically, theoretically. Even if we say, look, let's just do that at 20% of that level, we can put an enormous amount of water into that soil, which will obviously not run into the ocean. So yes, we can slow down sea level rise, but it's again a little bit pedantic because at the end of the day we've got to cool the planet. There's no point having bigger band-aids to put to slow down sea level rise unless we actually cool the planet hydrologically. We're just playing with ourselves, right? It's just playing with numbers. It's also what we talked about, resilience. That is really important for buffering because it isn't just sea level rise, it's just floods, it's the erosion, it's the damage of that flood peak. And actually this is so important to understand. And this is where, again, from an urban management thing, it's just critical. And this is just simply a flood hydrograph, right? And we've had these in flood. But basically you get a rain event and you get a flood peak. And of course it's the height of this flood peak That's where the damage is happening, right? So if you've got a concreted catchment, bang, you've got a rain event, you've got a flood peak, but basically in no time it's all just, it's done all the destruction, it's wiped out your bridges, it's eroded your field, and basically you're back to nothing. If you build a soil carbon sponge, you get a completely different hydrolate, because now you've basically got that curve, the same, actually I've drawn it differently, but you've got the same volume of water, so actually, so you've got the same volume of water, okay, but the point is you stretch the longevity of the valve, it's longevity of green thing, it's of really critical importance. And basically you've got no damage, but more importantly you can get away with 10% of the civil engineering infrastructure. The culverts, the stormwater drains, the bridges, the roads, the billions of dollars of repair are all saved because you're using this resilient buffering of the soil carbon sponge. Powerful thing. So I'm talking about Michael Krafchik. I mean, you know Michael, and no argument. He talks about the latent head fluxes and cooling and the same thing. But this business of, unless you actually get to sort of like, here is a comprehensive cooling of the planet as a solution, and these resilience buffering through the sponge, you are just putting another band-aid on the thing. I'm not knocking people trying to put band-aids or mop up CO2 or mop up the blood, but at the end of the day we've got to heal the patient, make it healthy, otherwise we haven't got a future.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah,
mathematically
no,
inclined.
you had
so
a question too, actually, so if you wanted to repeat.
yes, I had a question about the time frame.
Yeah.
The most optimistic, or at
Yeah.
least, I don't know what the range
No,
is.
okay,
Other people
okay,
can
and in the
trust.
sense, you know, I interrupted rudely, you know, but the point is that, yeah, look, my guess is from what's happening, these extremes are now intensifying. You've had a drought, you've had floods, you've had wildfires, you've had landslips. It's going to intensify, it's not going to get easier.
Right.
And so within the next 10 years, if we haven't actively started building resilience, you know, and if we haven't, I mean, cooling, we've got a little bit longer, but the point is if we haven't actively started buffering and resilience building in our system, I think that the extremes and the social, it's not the physical extremes, it's the social collapse as a consequence of the extremes. We've got a civil war in Syria at the moment, and we say, hey, that's a civil war and it's terrible and so many million people have died. But basically 10 years ago, before the civil war, we had the peasants abandoning their farmland on the Fertile Crescent after 30 years of green revolution agriculture, high input, more on agriculture. Okay? That's M-O-R-N. Who was laughing? Peace, Kelly.
Okay, got it. Would you also repeat? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, okay. So what I'm saying is that these people were leaving the Fertile Crescent. They've been farming for 10,000 years. That was a cradle of civilization. Right. So the farmers, the peasants were leaving their land because they totally oxidized their carbon, they totally collapsed their soil structure, they totally desertified, they couldn't farm anymore, so they were moving into Damascus and Aleppo.
But that was
we know exactly 3 years later what happened.
That was the deregulation of the steppe back in the 60s, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that what happened? They were kind of managing it as a commons?
Yes.
And then they actually...
Yeah. And in a sense it's happened time and time again. China's had to take 19 million hectares out of food production because it's contaminated with toxins because, again, bureaucratic silly decisions. Right?